33 people. That's how many lives she saved before they dragged her to the stake. The plantation records from coastal South Carolina tell of a slave woman whose healing touch became legendary across 3 counties, until the very families she cured turned against her. On the morning of August 14, 1748, guards opened the iron door of the Georgetown District Jail to retrieve the condemned healer for execution. The cell was empty. No broken locks, no tunnel, no accomplice. Just gone. Local magistrates ordered the incident erased from official records, and for nearly 3 centuries, her story remained buried in sealed church archives and private family journals. Tonight, you'll hear what really happened to the woman they called a witch, and why her disappearance terrified an entire community more than any execution ever could. Before we continue with the story of the healer who vanished from a locked cell, if you're fascinated by mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about American history, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss stories like this. And tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? I love hearing where my audience discovers these forgotten tales. Now, let's step back to 1731, to a place where survival meant understanding the fine line between gift and curse. What the Georgetown magistrates couldn't erase, however, were the whispered accounts that survived in family Bibles, in marginalia of ledgers, in letters tucked between pages of forgotten books. And it's from these fragments that we piece together what truly happened. The settlement that would become Georgetown sat like a jewel along the Winyah Bay, where 4 rivers converged to create one of the finest natural harbors on the Atlantic coast. By 1731, Rice had transformed the Low Country into a landscape of engineered waterways and vast plantations that stretched inland for miles. The humid air hung thick with mosquitoes and money, both equally relentless. The Fairmont plantation occupied nearly 800 acres of prime tidal land, its rice fields organized in a geometric pattern that would have impressed any European engineer. The main house, built of cypress and tabby, that distinctive mixture of oyster shells, sand and lime, stood 2 stories tall with wide piazzas designed to catch the slightest breeze. Inside, imported furniture from England mixed with pieces crafted by skilled enslaved carpenters whose names would never appear in any record book. Jonathan Fairmont had inherited the property from his father, along with 63 enslaved people, whose value on paper exceeded the land itself. He was 29 years old, educated at the College of William and Mary, and possessed that particular combination of ambition and insecurity common to second sons of wealthy families. His wife, Catherine, was 16 when they married, the daughter of a Charleston merchant whose fortune came from the triangular trade. She had pale skin that burned easily in the Carolina sun and a persistent cough that the local physician attributed to weakness of constitution. The enslaved community at Fairmont lived in 2 rows of small cabins behind the main house, far enough for propriety, but close enough for quick summons. They worked the rice fields during the day, back-breaking labor in water that reached their thighs, under a sun that could kill a man in hours. At night, they maintained their own small gardens, their own customs, their own quiet acts of resistance. Sarah arrived in early spring of 1731, sold from a plantation in Virginia after her previous owner died interstate. The bill of sale listed her age as approximately 25, her condition as healthy, her skills as domestic work. It mentioned nothing about the small leather pouch she wore around her neck, or the knowledge she carried that couldn't be appraised or inventoried. She was tall for a woman of her time, with hands that moved with peculiar precision when she touched anything green and growing. Her eyes held something that made people uncomfortable. Not defiance exactly, but an unsettling quality of observation, as if she saw more than what appeared on the surface. She spoke little during those first weeks, learning the rhythms of Fairmont, the personalities that ruled it, the small tyrannies and larger cruelties that structured each day. It was one of the field workers, a man named Thomas, whose legs bore the scars of shackle sores that never fully healed, who first saw what she could do. He'd cut his hand badly on an oyster shell while repairing one of the trunk gates that controlled water flow into the rice fields. The wound festered in the heat, turning angry red, then black at the edges. The overseer, a Scotsman named Duncan MacLeish, noted it in his log but did nothing. A dead slave was expensive, but so was the doctor's time. Thomas showed the wound to Sarah one evening after the work bell rang. She examined it without speaking, then disappeared into the woods beyond the slave quarters. She returned an hour later with a handful of plants that looked like common weeds to anyone else. Using a flat stone, she crushed certain leaves into a paste, mixed it with clean water from the well, and bound the mixture against his wound with strips of cloth. Within 3 days, the black had retreated. Within a week, the wound closed. Within 2 weeks, Thomas could grip an axe handle without wincing. Word spread quickly through the quarters, the way important information always traveled. In glances, in deliberately casual conversation, in the careful code that the enslaved developed to protect what mattered. Others came to her with their ailments. A woman suffering from fever following childbirth. A child with a cough that wouldn't stop. An elderly man with joints so swollen he could barely walk. Sarah treated them all, usually at night, usually in silence. She never asked for payment. What could they give? But recipients left small gifts anyway. A carved wooden spoon, a handful of rice saved from their rations, a scrap of blue cloth. The first time anyone from the main house noticed was in July, when the overseer MacLeish developed a stomach complaint so severe he couldn't leave his small house near the rice mill. For 2 days, he writhed in agony, while his assistant sent a messenger to Georgetown for the doctor. But the doctor was attending a difficult childbirth 20 miles away and wouldn't come. One of the house slaves, a woman named Betty, who'd watched Sarah work, suggested quietly to Catherine Fairmont that perhaps Sarah knew something about healing. Catherine, desperate as her husband grew increasingly angry about the plantation's halted supervision, agreed. Sarah examined the overseer with the same careful attention she gave everyone. His symptoms suggested something he'd eaten, combined with the brackish water from the well near the rice fields. She prepared a tea from bark she gathered from specific trees, added roots dug from specific spots in the forest, and made him drink it 3 times daily while she monitored his recovery. Within 4 days, MacLeish was back on his horse, shouting orders across the fields. Jonathan Fairmont noted this in his ledger. The slave woman Sarah has demonstrated knowledge of herbal remedies, proved useful with overseer's illness, may serve household purposes. Catherine's cough worsened through the late summer. What began as a mild irritation became a persistent racking that shook her thin frame. The Georgetown physician, Dr. Archibald Hayes, prescribed bleeding, then purging, then a tonic of his own invention that cost Jonathan £3 and did absolutely nothing. By September, Catherine could barely leave her bed. She'd grown so thin that her collarbones protruded sharply beneath her nightgown. She coughed blood into handkerchiefs that the house slaves burned in secret. Jonathan grew desperate, his worry manifesting as irritation with everyone around him. Betty suggested Sarah again. This time, Jonathan himself summoned the healer to the main house. Sarah stood in the doorway of Catherine's bedroom, taking in everything with those observant eyes. The windows kept closed despite the heat, the chamber pot that smelled of infection, the pale, damp skin, the shallow, rapid breathing. She stepped closer, placed her hand on Catherine's forehead, then her chest, then her back, feeling for something that couldn't be seen. "She needs air," Sarah said. Her voice was surprisingly clear, with an accent that suggested origins farther north. "Clean air, and the windows must open." The physician said drafts would worsen her condition, Jonathan protested. Sarah looked at him directly, a moment of eye contact that would have earned most enslaved people a strike. The physician is wrong. Perhaps it was desperation, or perhaps something in Sarah's certainty, but Jonathan ordered the windows opened. Sarah returned that evening with bundles of plants wrapped in cloth. She boiled water in the kitchen, an act that scandalized the cook who ran that domain, and steeped leaves and roots in careful proportions. The resulting tea smelled of mint and something sharper, almost medicinal. She made Catherine drink it 3 times daily. She also mixed a paste that she instructed be rubbed on Catherine's chest and back before sleep. Most importantly, she insisted Catherine sit outside on the piazza for 2 hours each morning and evening, breathing the river air. Dr. Hayes, when he learned of this treatment, pronounced it dangerous superstition and warned Jonathan that he was risking his wife's life by allowing a slave's ministrations. But Catherine was dying under Hayes's care, so Jonathan continued Sarah's regimen. 3 weeks later, Catherine walked downstairs to dinner. 4 weeks later, her cough had diminished to occasional clearing. 6 weeks later, she asked for her sewing basket, a sure sign of returning strength. The story spread through Georgetown society with the speed of scandal. The Fairmont slave who'd saved Catherine's life became a topic of parlor conversation. Other plantation families began sending for her, always carefully, always with the proper permissions negotiated between owners, because a skilled slave's time was valuable property. Sarah treated Rebecca Thornton's infant son when he developed a fever that 3 doctors couldn't break. She cured Samuel Hartwell's persistent headaches that had plagued him for years. She helped Anne Colleton's elderly mother when nobody believed the woman would survive the winter. She treated infected wounds, delivered babies, eased the pain of those dying from ailments nobody could cure, and turned away no one who came to her with genuine need. The enslaved community watched this development with mixed feelings. Sarah's gifts brought her privileges: better food, a private room in one of the cabins, exemption from field work. But gifts that made you valuable to white owners were dangerous. Valuable property was guarded closely, controlled tightly, and property that became too important, too independent, too confident in its own worth, that property needed to be reminded of its place. Sarah kept careful records, though she couldn't write. She notched a small piece of wood for each person she treated, marking whether they were enslaved or free, whether they survived or died. By her count, she'd successfully treated 33 people by the spring of 1748. The 34th would change everything. His name was Benjamin, and he was Jonathan Fairmont's only son, born in 1743 when Catherine was 28, and everyone had begun to assume she'd remain childless. The boy was indulged, adored, the center of both parents' lives and the future of the Fairmont plantation. He was 5 years old when he developed a fever in April 1748. Sarah examined him with her usual care. The fever was high, but not dangerously so. His symptoms suggested a common childhood illness. She'd seen it dozens of times in the slave quarters. She prepared her remedies: fever-reducing tea, cool compresses, specific herbs to prevent the illness from settling into his lungs. She instructed Betty on the exact schedule of treatments. But Jonathan, panicked by his son's illness, also summoned Dr. Hayes. The physician arrived the next morning, examined Benjamin, and prescribed his standard treatment, bleeding to release the bad humors. Sarah, when she learned of this, objected. She found Jonathan in his study and spoke with an urgency that approached impertinence. "The bleeding will weaken him. He needs his strength to fight the fever. Please, just continue what I've started. 3 more days, and he'll recover." Dr. Hayes, overhearing this exchange, turned purple with rage. "You dare question my medical judgment? I studied at Edinburgh University. I have treated patients across 2 continents. And you, a slave woman with some hedge-witch knowledge of weeds, presume to countermand my professional opinion?" The confrontation escalated. Dr. Hayes insisted that Jonathan must choose either Hayes's educated treatment or Sarah's plantation superstitions, but not both. To continue with Sarah's remedies while rejecting Hayes's advice would be to publicly humiliate a respected physician, an insult no gentleman could permit. Jonathan chose Dr. Hayes. He ordered Sarah back to the quarters and specifically forbade her from entering the main house. Dr. Hayes bled Benjamin twice over the next 2 days. The boy grew weaker, his fever spiking higher. On the 3rd day, he developed a rash that Hayes interpreted as evidence the bad humors were being expelled. On the 4th day, Benjamin couldn't keep down water. On the 5th day, he died. Catherine's screams could be heard across the plantation. Jonathan sat in his study and drank himself into a stupor. Dr. Hayes, after examining the body, declared that the boy had succumbed to a malignant fever beyond any treatment's reach and collected his fee before departing. In the slave quarters, Sarah wept for a child she couldn't save because they wouldn't let her try. The funeral took place on a grey morning with half of Georgetown society in attendance. Catherine, dressed in black that made her look ghostly, could barely stand. Jonathan's face had set into a mask of rage that needed a target. 3 days after they buried Benjamin, that target revealed itself. The accusation began quietly, like poison seeping into water. Dr. Hayes, during a dinner at the Thornton plantation, mentioned casually that he'd always found it peculiar how the slave Sarah's remedies seemed to work so effectively. Almost unnatural, he mused, swirling wine in his glass. One wonders what precisely goes into those concoctions of hers. Rebecca Thornton, whose infant son Sarah had saved years earlier, felt a chill of unease. What if Sarah's healing wasn't medicine, but something darker? She'd never actually seen what Sarah put in those teas and pastes. Nobody had. The whisper spread through Georgetown society like fever through an unventilated sick room. Sarah's remedies worked too well to be simple herbalism. There must be something else. Some secret knowledge, some pact or power that exceeded normal human ability. And if she could heal with such effectiveness, couldn't she also harm? Hadn't Benjamin Fairmont died after Sarah's remedies were stopped? What if the remedies themselves had caused a dependency, a corruption in the boy's body that made him vulnerable once they were withdrawn? What if Sarah had been slowly poisoning him all along for reasons only she understood? The theological implications were discussed in parlor conversations across the region. South Carolina had no history of witch trials like Massachusetts, but the colonists knew the stories. They knew that Satan worked through human instruments, often choosing society's most vulnerable, women, servants, slaves, to do his bidding. Wasn't it suspicious that a slave woman possessed knowledge that exceeded trained physicians? Where could such knowledge come from, except a supernatural source? Jonathan Fairmont, drowning in grief and rage, seized on these whispers like a drowning man grasping at driftwood. His son was dead. Someone must be responsible. And if Sarah's healing had always been devilish rather than divine, then she'd been corrupting his household for 17 years. Perhaps Catherine's recovery had been false, a temporary reprieve granted by dark powers to lull them into trust. Perhaps every cure she'd performed had extracted some spiritual price that would eventually be collected. On May 3, 1748, Jonathan filed a formal complaint with the Georgetown magistrate, accusing Sarah of practicing witchcraft, of using diabolical arts and poisonous substances to achieve her cures, and of deliberately causing his son's death through supernatural means. The charge was legally absurd. South Carolina had no witchcraft statutes, and the colonial government generally discouraged such prosecutions as primitive superstition. But the magistrate, a wealthy planter himself, who'd lost 2 slaves to mysterious illnesses the previous year, agreed to investigate. Sarah was arrested on May 5th. They came at dawn, 3 men led by McLeish the overseer, who seemed to take particular pleasure in finally exerting authority over someone who'd always made him vaguely uncomfortable. They found her in her cabin, awake. She always rose before dawn, grinding herbs with her stone pestle. The leather pouch she wore around her neck was removed and searched. Inside they found dried leaves of several plants, small roots wrapped in cloth, a piece of quartz crystal, and a small book, handwritten, its pages covered in notes and drawings of plants. "She can write," McLeish said, genuinely shocked. "A slave who can write." Literacy among enslaved people was illegal in South Carolina, punishable by whipping, but that transgression paled beside the witchcraft accusation. The book, written in a mixture of English and another language nobody recognized, was presented as evidence of her occult knowledge. They took her to Georgetown in shackles, an unnecessary cruelty as she made no attempt to resist, and locked her in the jail behind the courthouse. The building was brick, recently constructed, with 3 cells and iron doors that were supposed to represent the advance of civilization into the wilderness. The trial, such as it was, took place over 2 days in late May. Dr. Hayes testified that Sarah's remedies violated natural law and medical science. Rebecca Thornton testified that Sarah had always seemed uncanny in her abilities. Other witnesses came forward with stories. Sarah had once predicted which plantation slave would become ill before any symptoms appeared. She'd found water during a drought by walking through the woods, as if led by invisible guidance. She'd once looked at a pregnant woman and known the child would be born with a defect, and she'd been correct. Each story, innocent in isolation, accumulated into a portrait of someone who possessed knowledge beyond human capacity. Sarah was not permitted to testify in her own defense. Slaves couldn't give testimony against white citizens. But the magistrate, troubled by the proceedings' irregular nature, asked if she had anything to say regarding the charges. She stood in the courtroom, still wearing the plain gray dress she'd been arrested in, and spoke clearly. "I learned healing from my mother, who learned from her mother. Every plant has properties. Every illness has patterns. I watch. I remember. I learn. There's no magic in it, only attention and care." "Then explain," the magistrate said, "how you knew Rebecca Thornton's child would survive when 3 physicians said he would die." Sarah looked at him steadily. The physicians were draining his blood when he needed fluids. They were closing the windows when he needed air. They were treating their theories instead of watching the actual child. I watched. I saw. I acted. The child lived because I paid attention to what was real instead of what I'd been taught. The courtroom murmured at this near insolence. The magistrate frowned. Dr. Hayes looked furious. The verdict came quickly. Guilty of practicing witchcraft and causing death through supernatural means. The sentence handed down on May 28th was death by burning, to be carried out at dawn on June 1st. Catherine Fairmont, when she heard the verdict, took to her bed and wouldn't speak. Jonathan drank and told himself justice had been served. The enslaved community at Fairmont said nothing aloud but gathered in the evenings to whisper prayers and fears. In her cell, Sarah sat with her back against the cold brick and calculated her chances of survival. The jailkeeper was a man named Hosea Jenkins, 43 years old, who supplemented his meager government salary by running a small cooperative business in his spare time. He was not a cruel man by nature, but neither was he particularly compassionate. Prisoners were prisoners, and his job was to keep them locked up until the law decided otherwise. Sarah was his only current prisoner. Georgetown was small enough that serious crime remained rare. He brought her food twice daily, corn mush in the morning, rice and beans in the evening, water when she asked. He rarely spoke to her except to announce when he was opening the cell door. But on the evening of May 29th, 2 days before her scheduled execution, Jenkins found Sarah sitting cross-legged in her cell, eyes closed, lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been something else. When he set down her food, she opened her eyes and looked at him. "Your daughter suffers from headaches," she said. Jenkins froze. His daughter Martha, aged 11, did indeed suffer from terrible headaches that left her bedridden for days at a time. But he'd told no one in Georgetown about this. It was family business, private, and besides, who could help? "How do you know about Martha?" he asked. "You have lines around your eyes that come from worry, not age. You carry the smell of feverfew. You've been trying to treat someone with it, but feverfew alone won't help if the headaches come from pressure in the skull. You need willow bark tea mixed with feverfew given at the onset of pain, not after it's established. And she should sleep with her head elevated on 2 pillows instead of 1. Jenkins stared at her. "You're about to burn for witchcraft, and you're giving me medical advice?" I'm about to burn for healing people, Sarah corrected. There's a difference. That night, Jenkins went home and prepared the tea exactly as Sarah described. When Martha's headache began the next morning, he could always tell by how she squinted at the light. He gave her the tea and elevated her head. Within an hour, the pain receded instead of building. By afternoon, Martha was up and playing with her younger brothers. Jenkins sat in his small house that evening and wrestled with his conscience. The law said Sarah would burn. The court had decided. But the law had also said that healing his daughter's pain was witchcraft, and if that was witchcraft, then the law itself was sick. He made a decision that would cost him everything. On the evening of May 31st, after darkness fell, Jenkins visited Sarah's cell. "I'm going to unlock this door," he said quietly. "In 10 minutes, I'll be in my office, facing away from the cells, examining ledgers that require my complete attention. What happens after that is between you and God." Sarah stood. "They'll know you helped. They'll suspect. They won't prove. I'm a free man. They can't torture a confession out of me, and I'll have plausible story about falling asleep at my desk." He paused. "My Martha is 11 years old. Before you treated her headaches, she spent half her life in pain. That's worth my job, maybe worth more. Where should I go? North. Follow the river inland, away from the plantations. There are places in the backcountry where nobody asks questions, where people need healing and don't care where it comes from. You'll find help if you're careful." He handed her a small bundle. "Food, a knife, flint. It's all I can spare." Just when we thought the story would end at the stake, one man's conscience changed everything. If you're gripped by this tale of courage and impossible choices, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this video with someone who loves true historical mysteries. And drop a comment with your theory. Do you think Sarah made it to freedom? Or did they catch her before dawn? Let's find out what happened next together. At midnight on June 1st, Sarah walked out of her cell. She moved through the darkened jail like smoke, making no sound. Jenkins sat at his desk, his back to the cells, his hands trembling slightly as he pretended to review supply ledgers by candlelight. She paused at his door. "Thank you," she said softly. He didn't turn around. "Go." Sarah disappeared into the Carolina night. Dawn came precisely at 5:47 a.m. on June 1st, 1748. The execution was scheduled for 6 Gau, giving the condemned time to make final prayers. When Jenkins arrived at the cell to escort Sarah to the stake that had been prepared in the courthouse square, he performed his role with convincing shock and alarm. "She's gone. The prisoner has escaped." The magistrate was summoned from his bed. Jonathan Fairmont arrived within 20 minutes, still buttoning his coat. Dr. Hayes came to observe and provide medical expertise should anyone be injured during the search.